Hello, Virtual APSA viewers. This is a presentation for the Duck of Minerva's Virtual APSA 2012 project. My name's Rob Farley, and my panel was supposed to be on Sunday morning and was supposed to be on my book, which was titled Abolish the Air Force. Interesting development, interesting thing. The panel was going to be missing at least two of its members, which meant effectively we were having a panel without members. The book, for a variety of tragic reasons, no longer had a contract or a publisher. And then the conference ceased to have a conference. And so really what this is a panel without people for a book without a publisher for a conference that never happened, which really brings up a whole variety of existential questions about academia and so forth. I should note that this entire process has sort of allowed me to work through a whole new mix of bitterness and despair pretty much every day, which is actually fairly interesting and entertaining. But none of that is either here or there. And so what I'm trying to do now is to talk about abolishing the Air Force. The core of my argument is that air power as conceived of in the modern British, American, and Israeli, to a lesser extent Israeli context, is culturally and institutionally anti-Clausewitzian, that it attempts to escape three critical Clausewitzian injunctions and therefore runs into consistent difficulties in real-world application. These injunctions are as follows. First, that air power, as conceived of in the Anglo-American context, tends to try to avoid disarming the enemy, avoid destroying enemy forces, in preference for defeating the enemy through other means, whether through the bombing of cities, the destruction of infrastructure, or the destruction of key nodes of communication that render enemy organizations unable to act. Second, that air power in this context attempts to yoke politics to technology. It allows technology, and in particular air power technology, to drive political understanding, such that the wars that we engage upon become driven by the constraints and opportunities provided by air power, rather than by the political logic of the conflicts themselves. And we see, for example, that conflicts escape their political bounds due to the operational needs of an air power campaign. Third, I argue that air power in the Anglo-American context effectively ignores the fog of war, the Clausewitzian fog of war, by implying, suggesting, and sometimes outright arguing that it is possible to achieve near omniscience over the battlefield, and not simply the battlefield, but also over the broader social framework of conflict. And you find this, and we'll go into this a little bit later, but you find this in both new and old air power theory, where there's the suggestion that society is open to our understanding, enemy organizations, military organizations are open to our understanding, and that we have the capacity to effectively push buttons to make them do what we want them to do. Obviously, this is a topic that touches on a broad literature in political science, not simply a literature on military organizations, but also literature on organizations and organizational behavior, and on the behavior of foreign policy and the foreign policy bureaucracy. Military organizations such as the United States Air Force, but also the Army and the Royal Air Force and so forth, are, of course, major bureaucracies. They behave like other bureaucracies. They fight each other over resources, over missions, over turf, as James Q. Wilson described it. It turns out, and I think that this is a defensible claim, that aviation disputes tend to intensify inter-service conflict, and that this is the case in both the United States and the United Kingdom, perhaps less so in some other countries when air power is emerging from a different cultural context. but certainly since the development of aviation in the US and the UK, there have been repeated conflicts that have been driven by aviation. Just a few of these are carrier aviation in both countries, close air support, interdiction in both countries, air transport in both countries, anti-submarine warfare in both countries, helicopter aviation in both countries, missiles and drones, especially in the United States. These are all aviation-driven conflicts, not necessarily driven by the Air Force or air power theorists, but driven by the changes wrought by aviation in the battlefield and on in the strategic context. There are good inter-service conflicts. There are some inter-service conflicts that give civilians the opportunity to make informed judgments as to the requirements of national strategy and national grand strategy, and as to the connections between grand strategy and military, or the ends of grand strategy and military means. However, there are also a number of destructive inter-service conflicts where effectively the means for conducting a particular mission are divided between two different organizations. And these conflicts tend to be particularly common in context where aviation assets are concerned. Close air support is a great example of this, where the assets for attacking enemy troop concentrations in close proximity to the front lines are very often with air forces, whereas the need for such attacks is felt most deeply among land forces, and yet there's a division between the one and the other. The book emphasizes the contingency of the current institutional arrangements that we have. There are a wide variety of different organizational structures that are plausible and possible for regulating our aviation assets, and lots of different countries do lots of different things. The Chinese, for example, have a single overarching organization, and within that they have different organizations for naval aviation, for what amounts to army aviation, and for missiles. The Soviets had a very different set of organizational arrangements for their aviation. They divided air defense from tactical air power, from strategic air power, from missiles in a way that the United States doesn't. Even the United States and the United Kingdom divide their air power differently, with the Royal Air Force controlling, so broadly speaking, a greater portion of the air power pie than the United States Air Force does. There are no given constraints on what military institutional arrangements should look like. We could imagine a situation in which, obviously, as some of the other countries have, missiles have their own branch. We could conceivably even imagine a constellation of military services where submarines had their own branch. The simple fact that there are three media of military action, air, sea, and land, does not mean that there need to be three services. We have to evaluate what the effects of the institutional constellation that we decide upon are upon national policy, upon military procurement, and on military performance. So that said, the book unsurprisingly argues that the track record of independent air forces, and more specifically the track record of aviation enthusiasts and air power theorists, is not good and has not been good since they began theorizing. One curmudgeonly reviewer suggested that this part of the book involves dead arguments against dead men, which should be considered irrelevant for any sort of modern consideration of the role of the United States Air Force. I think that this is completely wrong, that the origins of the RAF and the USAF remain relevant to how the organizations behave today and how we can conceive of the organizations moving forward. It's unsurprising that air power advocates want to discard some element of these histories, because their predictions about how warfare will be conducted and about the effectiveness of aviation assets, especially in particular missions, have very often been found wanting. Moreover, it is not at all difficult to draw out threads of the original air power enthusiasts, the original air power theorists, and latter-day prophets of air power. There are very clear connections between Trenchard, Billy Mitchell, Julia Duhet, and modern air power theorists such as John Boyd and John Warden. There are consistencies, arguments about the supremacy of air power, arguments about the ability of air power to win conflicts cheaply and quickly, about the ability of air power to pierce and eliminate the fog of war, about the ability of air power to defeat enemies without resort and without collaboration with the other services. Needless to say, these threads lead in very similar directions, and so you find important resonances between the arguments for the existence of the United States and the Royal Air Force in the 1920s and the 1940s, and arguments over the role that air power plays today in drones and counterinsurgency and so forth. It's not hard to find those resonances; they're quite clear. And so, whereas the men may be dead, the arguments are far from dead. And so, the book, in its totality, argues that the United States Air Force, and by extension, presumably, the Royal Air Force should be eliminated, that the assets that are currently allocated to these institutions should be folded into the other constituent military institutions in particular, that the assets that we now broadly associate with TAC Air in the United States Air Force should be folded into the Army, that the assets associated with the strategic assets should be folded into the Navy, nuclear weapons should be given to the Navy. The book argues that this will lead to better warfighting, will lead to better advice for civilians, more realistic appraisals of what future conflicts will look like, and will lead to better procurement, such that we don't have essentially the triarchy of needs between the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy in the United States, and will also make it possible to avoid destructive inter-service conflicts that we still see with regards to some critical missions such as interdiction, air support, air transport, and so forth. And so that's the case. We get rid of the Air Force. Thank you for listening, and enjoy your virtual APSA.